present across the screen in the brutal Bruce Biz Book Quiz Home Invasion version, because that's certainly what it is. Thank you all very much for making time to be here. It's a real opportunity for me.
Get on with it, get on with it, get on with it, get on with it.
And you know what's so wonderful about this is I can mute him. Because I'm in control of the Zoom session, exactly as he presses that button to mute me, I can mute him. So the tables have really, truly, truly, truly turned. And I'm so excited about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to talk about this. It's Bruce Whitfield's, I think, first book, The Upside of Down. I don't think that the timing could be better. And with that, I'm going to unmute Bruce and welcome him to his very own first ever digital book launch. Bruce, welcome.
Bob, thanks very much. It's lovely to see you across the many, many miles that separate us. And yeah, you say this is perfect timing. The material is perfect timing, but the book, like everybody else, is locked down and nobody can get hold of the physical copy. So there are thousands of these things gathering dust in bookshops around the country. But hopefully, once the lockdown ends, and it will, people will be able to get hands on physical copies. But the digital books are available if anybody would like those. I posted a link this morning. But yeah, this book is all your fault because September last year, you summoned me to a lunch, didn't you?
I did. I certainly did. The story goes, I invited Bruce to lunch without telling him who the third party at the lunch would be. And to his horror, he sat down, we started eating lunch, and then we were joined by Terry from Pan Macmillan, who's the CEO of Pan Macmillan South Africa. I did an introduction and then got up and walked out. It was that simple to get Bruce writing.
Yep, and at that lunch, Terry said, so have you got any ideas? And I went, well, I've got a few ideas. I've been doing corporate talks for a couple of years. I did a first one called The Upside of Down, and her eyes shone at that particular point because I think she saw the title long before I did of the book. And then I did one called How to Thrive at the Edge of Chaos, and another called Rebels, Renegades, and Problem Solvers. And as we sort of did a mind map of the three talks that I've been doing over the years, it became very clear that the time was come to pull them all together with a bunch of with additional information and with some fresh data on the state of South Africa and to write a book. It started out life with a very different title. And just in case my dad is subscribed, which is unlikely, he's 92 and can't switch his phone on, but I'm not going to give you that original title. But it was quite a rude worded title because the F word was in every single title, but it was about South Africa being too important to fail. And so the original sort of genesis, if you like, of the book was a discussion around why it is that South Africa is simply too important to fail. And that was the basis of it. And as the book took shape, there were days when you feel hyper positive and days when you feel hyper negative as the data you collect points to extreme negativity, the inevitability of what we've now seen last Friday in terms of a ratings downgrade, the real issues in South Africa of inequality and mass poverty and the deep structural problems within South Africa. And you go, oh God, can I really write a positive book about South Africa? Then you start talking to people and interviewing people. You start interviewing people with a growth mindset. You start interviewing people with a positive outlook. You start interviewing problem solvers, and then you get all hyper motivated because this is an extraordinary place with extraordinary problems, but it is a place also that needs those problems resolved. And those problems have just been amplified dramatically by COVID-19, and not only COVID-19, but then accelerated even further by the fact that Moody's has been the last of the big three ratings agencies, the ratings agency that hates us least to put us into sub-investment grade. So we've got a lot going against us, but frankly, often when there's a lot going against us, it just simply creates more opportunities to fix problems.
But Bruce, I liked your opening ambit in the book because the opening statements that you make, the first paragraph or so, really is one that
is that as far as you got?
Actually, no. I read the book. I very easily read the book. I found it very readable. I thought it would inspire me because I'm facing around 460 businesses phoning and complaining about everyday life in South Africa right now. What's interesting is just yesterday, I had a webinar session with 68 British businesses. And at the end of the debates around what they're doing in response to the challenges of their lockdown, I immediately went straight back to your book, because I honestly think that this book needs to be read in that environment, even though they might not identify with a lot of the local issues, but the message behind it is, and it starts off with the first paragraph. It says, know what you're dealing with. And I remember you raising that book with me, Factfulness. It had a big impression on you. And after recommended reading by you, I read it myself.
This book.
It helped enormously. And I like the way that you set the scene around how we as South Africans, do we know our country or not? Because working with facts, as you stipulated in the book a little later on, is one of the key attributes of a winning mindset.
Absolutely, Pablo. I mean, I read Factfulness, and this is Hans Rosling's book. Tony Leon challenged me the other day online. Tony Leon, former politician. Can you ever be a former politician? Once a politician, always a politician. But to saying Hans Rosling, his philosophy isn't really aging very well right now, is it? And I said to him, frankly, Tony, it's too soon to tell, because what Hans Rosling did, medical doctor from Sweden, is he came out to Africa during one of the Ebola outbreaks, and he was looking at the Ebola outbreaks, and he was looking at data, and he was looking at information, and he didn't have enough medical resources. He didn't have enough access to medicine. He didn't have what he needed to deal with this flood of people that were coming to his clinic. So he started thinking differently about the problem, and he started looking at communities where there were outbreaks, and he started looking at data as to where the outbreaks were happening. And he started then focusing his messaging and focusing his treatments, and started focusing preventative care in areas where there were big problems. And in so doing, he stemmed the flood of people coming to his clinic, because suddenly, if you start the problem at source, you then have less of a problem further on. And it goes a long way to explain why we are in this lockdown right now. It's day 6 of the lockdown of at least 21 days. And I must emphasize that, because we simply don't know whether or not we get this thing under sufficient control within that period of time to allow us to go out and go back to what we think is normal. But Hans Rosling went and then developed a career in dealing with facts. And he said, you can't make judgments. Nobody can make a decision if your mind is clouded by fear. And fear is a massive inhibitor. Right now, what we are is incredibly frightened. We're frightened because there is this vicious and vulgar virus which is taking over the world. We're seeing images on our screens 24/7 of old people dying in Italy, of America apparently struggling to get this pandemic under control, huge criticism of Boris Johnson and the British government, a lack of clarity as to what's happening in places like North Korea and what's happening in places like Russia, and a lack of trust as to what's happening in China. And frankly, a complete lack of information as to what's happening on our own continent, simply because we don't have enough testing kits capacity to test. What we do know in our own environment, though, is that the South African government took control of this thing as early as I think was reasonably possible to do. 6th of March, they started paying very, very clear attention to this when we recorded our first case. And subsequent to that, we have seen President Cyril Ramaphosa actually doing what we've been wanting him to do on the economy for the last 2 years, acting suddenly and very decisively and very actively in order to first declare a state of disaster, national state of disaster, and then move it very rapidly, within a week, to say, hold on a second, we have to go into lockdown. The only way you stop this thing spreading. And what did he base it on? Well, he based it on facts. He based it on the information that was available around the world as to how other countries were succeeding, based on the severe lockdowns. I mean, the total lack of human rights involved in the Chinese experience, as far as I can see it, was extraordinary. People removed out of families, people taken away, people isolated, vigorous enforcement of that isolation. Looking at that experience, looking then at the Italian experience and other experiences where people were allowed free movement, where people were allowed to walk their dogs, and all of those things that South African middle classes are complaining about right now. And we dealt with facts in the same way as Hans Rosling says, you just get terrified if you deal with supposition, or you guessing, or you live in a social media world where there is deliberate information, misrepresentation, there are lies, there are people taking political advantage of each and every single statement that is made, of the details, the facts, people throwing questions in, curveballs in that are completely irrelevant to the facts. And just one last story before I go back to you, Pavlo. When I was talking to Laurie Dippenaar and GT Ferreira and Paul Harris, when they'd retired from First Rand. These are three guys that started the First Rand group. Before the collapse, it was a 450 billion Rand market cap financial services group. I've been too scared to look in the last week or two because it's a bit smaller than that now. But these three guys, I mean, three A-types, all working together in deep intimacy, their wives best of friends. And I said to them, how did you never fall out? Seriously, we had disagreements. I said, but how did you resolve your disagreements? How did you, the three brightest people in the country at that particular time who got together to start a bank, how did you stick together for 40 years to ensure that things didn't fall apart? And Laurie Dippenaar put it best. He said, we dealt with facts and only with facts. Whoever brought the best facts to the table won the day. And so in South Africa, if we deal with facts and only with facts, and then we act on those facts and we put the decisions that we take based on those facts into action, we get zillions of miles ahead really quickly, as we appear to be doing. And I say this with some caution because we don't know just how widespread the COVID-19 virus is. But right now, Cyril Ramaphosa has dealt with facts and has taken actions and is acting on those actions. And these are fundamental lessons for the future of South Africa post-COVID-19 as we go back to the difficult discussions on land reform, on property rights, on constitutional rights, on the future role of business in society, of government in society, all of these things. If we can learn some useful lessons from COVID-19 in terms of dealing with facts, we'll be ahead.
But Bruce, I think we can learn a lot more than just simply that part of it, because you went on to talk to a lot of the very well-established, very successful companies today, the circumstances that they were born out of, the circumstances that they faced when everyone else was fleeing, when everyone else saw no hope, no opportunity. These businesses were born from that. And it makes the title, The Upside of Down, so poignant, because I really think that as a country, for the very first time in our entire history, we are completely united by the threat of the COVID virus, both on society, on the business environment, our futures, and literally across the globe. Within that, you went on to talk extensively around education, and you mentioned Curo, you mentioned Spark Schools. You spoke about the successes that they had gleaned and gained by working effectively, smartly on the ground. And you compared that to, let's call it, the state educational system. And it seemed to me, as I read through the book, Bruce, that almost with every positive outcome being achieved through private sector intervention in education, the state almost felt like it dug its heels in further. Could the crisis we're facing now with COVID be the switch across over there, where state and the private sector start to learn more effectively together to build one single vision for South Africa?
I think it may be wishful thinking, and I don't mean to burst your bubble on this particular point, but yes, when there is a national goal, we do stand together and we do produce extraordinary results, whether it was 1995 and the Rugby World Cup, 1999 and the Rugby World Cup, whether it was the performance of the Ndlovu Youth Choir, for example. South Africans got terribly united around that, whether it was last year's Rugby World Cup, whether it was pulling off the 2010 Soccer World Cup in South Africa. Goals and united goals certainly do drive us to be our best selves. And right now, a very threat to our lives, never mind the economy. The economy is in big trouble and was before we went into this crisis. But the threat that unites us right now will disappear. And it is going to be up to us to ensure that the principles that we learn through this process are adhered to. What we're seeing happening right now is nothing short of extraordinary. And I've been having lots of off-the-record discussions with some very high-powered chief executives of very powerful organizations that have been instrumental in the background of this crisis. 2 or 3 weeks ago, government wasn't taking this as seriously as perhaps it could have been. Certainly 2 or 3 weeks ago, government wasn't considering the prospect of a shutdown. It was unthinkable But there was that critical discussion on the day that the president, it was the 15th of March, if memory serves, where the president went on TV on Sunday night and said, we have got a state of disaster in South Africa. This is what we fear. This is what we think. And that came after some very intense discussions behind the scenes with chief executives of large organizations, with representatives from civil society from across the board, that got into a room, hopefully with sensible social distancing, or physical distancing as we're calling it now, and got together and spelled it out and said to government, look, guys, this is real. There is incredible risk at play here. And to government's credit, they listened. The implementation of this thing has not been perfect. There have been draconian police actions for what looks like minor infringements of some of the more petty parts of the regulations around the lockdown. But by and large, and this is Hans Rosling's point as well, saying, by and large, the world is better today than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. Not in every respect, but in most respects. And in most respects, things improve gradually as we see improvements in science and technology, in our ability to navigate the world. So when it comes to government's handling of this crisis, credit must be given where credit is due, but credit is also due to lots of people behind the scenes. And we're not going to ever know all of the stories, because these are deeply private individuals, very influential individuals who, when it really matters, in the same way as when Nhlanhla Nene was fired and the bankers started phoning their friends within the ANC, and people like Patrice Motsepe, managed to get into Jacob Zuma's office and tell him what for in terms of the decision he'd made of firing Nhlanhla Nene and putting Des van Rooyen, goodness me, in charge of the National Treasury. It's at times of crisis where we dig deep and we go for the jugular when it's necessary. So we've shown under pressure that we can do it. We have to somehow, once the crisis has abated, because the next crisis is going to be the economy, we have to continue this high-level collaboration, very, very high-level collaboration. And government needs to be open to listen, and we need to be open to listen to government as well, because we know the tax takes are going to be down. We know that the economy is going to contract by as much as 5% this year on the basis that we're going to see just a 3-week shutdown. Edgars will be gone in a month or two. Companies will fail. Times are going to get incredibly tough. And unless we collaborate our way through this crisis, then we just exacerbate an even bigger one further down the road. So hopefully the lessons are learned.
Bruce, do you think we can afford to focus purely on the crisis as it is? Because right now, South Africa is listening, and South Africa is more engaged as a society, as business itself, than it's ever been before. Because in an environment of extreme pressure, of extreme apprehension, of extreme fear in the lives of private people and personal people, in that environment, that's when people are most ready to look for, seek, listen, contemplate a different way of doing things, a different ideology. And I refer to this very specifically because when I look at the big moves that were made by these entrepreneurs that you featured in the book, that led to them building opportunities where none seem to exist. If I look at how they think and how they behave, and I look at the conflict we've had, a growing conflict we've had as the private sector with government, where it's almost a combative relationship that now seems to be easing. Is this not the time that we should take on 3 big goals as opposed to just dealing with the COVID crisis? Should it not be the right time to reset and restructure the economy? You talk deeply about the economy in the book. You talk deeply about the concentration of the economy, about inequality, and the plight of mostly small, medium enterprises and businesses and entrepreneurs in that sense.
You're speaking like a real entrepreneur. You want all problems solved at once, Pavlo, and you want multiple work streams happening in parallel, and you want everybody to be pulling in the same direction. And I think that may be wishful thinking, simply because the magnitude of the health crisis is so big right now that we have to be absolutely sure that we can encircle this thing and do it quickly. Also, I don't think that business can be seen in a time of crisis to be leveraging it as an opportunity, as a bargaining chip for the immediate future. I think there's a very high risk that if we see business doing that, Business rather than being collaborative, business rather than being supportive, business rather than providing capital, as the Oppenheimers have done. My goodness me, Nikki and Jonathan Oppenheimer with R1 billion, Mary Oppenheimer and her daughters with R1 billion, the Ruperts with R1 billion, Patrice Motsepe and Sanlam and others with another R1 billion, Naspers with R1.5 billion. There's an incredible amount of goodwill being done. I asked Jonathan Oppenheimer this question on the radio last night. I said, you know what, you've been treated, your family's been treated incredibly badly by many in this country. You have been called all kinds of terrible things, but you've stepped up to the plate at this particular moment in time, and that is laudable. The moment you get a sense that anybody in the business environment is saying, you know what, this is all going so well, let's have a little mini Codessa in the background on the economy, I don't think that'll go down very well at all. Right now, there is incredible goodwill. Yes, there are an incredible number of positives being banked at the moment. And we must enjoy those positives being banked and at some point in the future, take advantage of those. Because when I looked at the tax tables in the February budget, and I just saw how heavily dependent South Africa is in the normal course of business on entrepreneurs, on millionaires, not even billionaires, but millionaires. I mean, there are only 120,000 people in South Africa who are registered as taxpayers earning more than R1.5 million a year. And together, they pay 20% of all taxes collected every year in South Africa, just 120,000 people. It's a tiny proportion of the overall population who contribute 20% of all taxes collected. Government understands it needs to be nice to rich people. It's not always seen to be the case, and sometimes you feel browbeaten and battered by SARS and the politics and the noise of the moment. But there is, I think, a growing appreciation, even before this COVID-19 crisis, a growing appreciation that we do have to give people a reason to stay. And that reason to stay is that you've got enormous opportunity in South Africa. I mean, just to go through some of the people I talk about in the book, whether it is Christo Wiese and Whitey Basson, and they're starting out with Pep stores in the late 1960s, of course, when they bought a few Pep stores, shops, and expanded that, got into food retail with ShopRite, and later on bought Checkers and OK Bazaars. It was all about opportunism in the time of crisis. And Christo Wiese, a week before the collapse of Steinhoff, incidentally, I went to go and see him and filmed a 45-minute interview with him. And he was just talking quite retrospectively all about the huge opportunities that they had taken. And he was a guy who took an enormous amount of risk. And eventually that risk-taking caught up with him and wiped out the vast majority of his considerable wealth. He's still a very wealthy individual. But individuals like Brian Joffe, for example, who goes and starts Bidvest in 1988. I mean, there isn't a darker time in South Africa's history than perhaps the period between 1990 and 1994, during which civil war beckoned, in which South Africa very nearly did teeter over the brink into failed state status, into civil war. But that's when Adrian Gore was building Discovery. Or 1987 also, when Robbie Brosen, as he reminded us, as he did that very emotional advert recently, with Nando's for the first time ever shutting down all of its grills, saying, you know, from our casa to your casa, we'll be back. These are guys who built businesses in incredibly testing times, incredibly difficult periods in our history. People who've now taken those businesses globally. I mean, the basis of the Thriving at the Edge of Chaos talk stems from an encounter that I had in Manchester. And there I was, I'd stepped out of a pub in Manchester where I'd been marveling at all of the beers that were available. And there was something like 20 different beers on tap in this beautiful pub with this massive wooden long bar counter. And I counted, out of those beers, 6 or 7 of them were brewed at the time by S.A.B. Miller, whether it was Pilsner Urquell or Grolsch or Foster's or whomever it was. There was Tyskie from Poland and others. All of these beers were brewed by a company that 20 years before had been sitting at number 1 Jan Smuts Avenue or number 2 Jan Smuts Avenue in Joburg, making Castle Lager and a bit of Olsen's and occasionally some Lion and Black Label under license. And I stepped out of this pub and I'd had only one beer, I promise. Only one Boddington's, because that's a good local Manchester beer. And I stepped out, and as I stood there, this white van came down the road and trundled past me, and it was a Bidvest Food Services truck. And I was just stunned in that moment as to what a wonderful coincidence it was. And I watched this truck go down the road, and I said, I must really give Brian Joffe a call and tell him I've seen one of his trucks in Manchester. That was before the split of Bidvest into Bidvest and Bidcorp. And as the truck disappeared into the gloom, there was a red chicken on a green background. It was Nando's. And I just thought to myself in that moment, something remarkable has happened in South Africa over the last 30 years, and that great businesses, great globally competitive businesses, have found their origin in South Africa, and many of them have expanded successfully internationally. And what was, to use the Nando's analogy, the secret sauce? The secret sauce was a couple of things. The environment created huge opportunity for bright young people, as they were back then, to seize those opportunities and to consolidate industries and to create new industries and to create new businesses. And the CapeTalk story, for goodness sake, starts in 2000. No sooner does it get started, but there's a small banks crisis. And we have this entire collapse of a financial system. Sambo goes down, BOE goes down, Nedbank is going to be next. And then the National Treasury steps in under Trevor Manuel and says, we'll guarantee deposits. Everybody calm the hell down. That time, there were about 20 small banks in South Africa. CapeTalk was one of them, and it was only one of 2 or 3 survivors that came out of it. And today, CapeTalk is one of the most extraordinary South African growth stories. And it just goes to show that if you've got the right business solving the right problem in this environment, there is incredible upside. I mean, I've got a question for you, and I'm more comfortable asking you questions than you asking me. But in November last year, the 5 years running up to November last year, what were the top 3 performing shares on the JSE? It's fundamentally changed now. But up until the 5 years, up until November last year, the Sunday Times Top 100 Companies Awards, what were the top 3 companies? Everybody can do this in your own heads as you sit there watching your screen going, Naspers. No, it's not Naspers. Naspers was number 5. What were the top 3 performing shares on the JSE over 5 years to November 2019? Pavlo?
I'm guessing CapeTalk was one of them.
Because you take my clues very well. You've learned. You've learned.
I'm guessing Cura was one of them.
Nope.
Not yet.
Cura's been an absolute dog of an investment. It's been a shocking investment. Great business, horrible investment, because investors got a bit overexcited and the share price ran far, far ahead of itself. But the top 3, I'll put you out of your misery because we could be here all day, and I'd enjoy torturing you for all of that time. But the top 3 performing shares on the JSE, CapeTalk by a country mile was the outperformer. Number 2 was Clicks. And number 3 was Transaction Capital. Now, what have those 3 companies got in common? One is in banking, one is in health and beauty, and the other is a taxi finance company that does some micro lending and does some debt collecting. But what have the 3 of them got in common?
Well, they all have the same customers. You see, people use taxis to go and get themselves beautified, and they have to spend money doing it.
That is one of the commonalities, absolutely. But
yeah, I knew I had it.
You don't have it. You have, I mean, you get 40% on the Whitfield-dometer of accuracy. But the one thing they've got in common is that they focused on their markets. They're focused on their customers. They're focused on the core market, that core market being South Africa. If you look at them throughout the last 10 years, not one of them has taken a cent out of South Africa to go and invest on some crackpot scheme. Not one of them went to go and buy a frozen foods business in the UK or a clothing retailer in the UK like Brait did, or like so many others did, Truworths and Foschini Group and others. In some cases buying some really awful businesses in other parts of the world. They saw them coming. Old Mutual, my goodness gracious me, more than 100 billion rand was squandered over 10 years trying to build this global insurance megalith out of South Africa first and then out of its London listing. Trillions of rand, and nobody can quantify it because I tried. I went to go and speak to asset managers. I spoke to National Treasury. I spoke to the Reserve Bank. I spoke to SARS. I spoke to everyone I could think of to say, could you put a number on the amount of money that South African corporates have peed up against the wall over the last 2 decades in their desperation to diversify from the mess that is South Africa? CapeTalk. transaction capital and clicks. Didn't do that. And they stuck to their knitting. They served their markets. And they, up until November last year, and that will be revised, obviously, by the clever people at Sunday Times when they do their awards later on this year. And the tables may very well have shifted, depending on, of course, what happens in stock markets. But it's really interesting that the top 3 performing shares on the JSE were all 100% focused on South Africa. The right businesses solving the right problems in this environment can be incredibly successful.
But Bruce, let me ask you this then, because South Africans still have global aspirations. Most of us have global aspirations. There's still very much a sentimental view, probably more than anything else, that we have got something to offer. Reverting back to this discussion I had with all these British business owners, what was so interesting is the first response to pressure on the economy was to furlough staff. A furlough is something that happens in the UK, it happens in the US. It's where effectively you send people home on reduced pay and government then tops up the pay. It's a form of, let's call it employment insurance. Of the 68 people that were on that call, just one, was talking about doubling down and investing on growth. And I think that we as South Africans do not have any understanding of how unconsciously resilient we've become as a result of the last 5 years or 10 years of building businesses in South Africa. So if I hold that idea in mind, and I think to probably one of the most viral clips you produced earlier this year, late last year at Davos, when you interviewed Richard Quest, and you asked him about our credibility in the global environment. And
what credibility?
He smirked at it, he sneered at it. So how do we play using our resilience? How do we play given the global perception of us? And how do we play into, because you write extensively around what excellence is and where we can seek excellence, how we can build excellence and why we need excellence again. How do you unfold those 3 elements together?
Sure. Thanks, Pav. That's the easy one of the day. I knew you would get me some point. But look, I mean, the fact is that we are massively underestimated globally. I think we also massively underestimate ourselves. Yes, we build incredibly tough and resilient businesses under very difficult and often hostile conditions in South Africa. And frankly, it's good to be underestimated because the buggers don't see you coming when you do come, and you come and buy their assets. For years, we've been taken as mugs, I think, in that global environment, and we've been treated as emerging market citizens who are there to be taken advantage of. We just simply need to be more alert to those factors, of course. We also underestimate our own abilities, but you've just got to look at the creation of Discovery, and whether you like Discovery or not, whether or not you like the ethos of the business, whether or not you are a blue, silver, gold or diamond member of Vitality, you've got to hand it to the team at Discovery, the brains trust at Discovery, because in building Vitality and getting access to health insurers around the globe, they've done something quite remarkable. And what they've got there is a 20% stake in Ping An, which is the health insurance arm of the biggest insurance company of the world called Ping An. So Ping An Health is where Discovery has got its stake. And whenever I get a chance, I say to Adrian Gore, is this your 10 cent? 10 cent, of course, referring to Koos Becker, who says that, these acquisition of a third of 10 cent for $200,000, $200 million, I beg your pardon, about 20 years ago was the luckiest deal of his life. He was about to capitulate on China, about to give up on China, and thank goodness he didn't. And I think we've got to remember those stories as well, in addition to the ones of incredible failure, where South African companies have diversified and have gone into international markets and have frankly blown it, embarrassed themselves, lost us trillions of rand. That there are outliers. SAB Miller, an incredible success story until it was bought up by AB InBev. And AB InBev has really done a terrible job at managing the assets that it acquired from SAB Miller, because it's already, before this COVID-19 crisis, had lost the entire purchase price and value of SAB Miller on the market capitalization of AB InBev. I think we need to cut ourselves some slack. I don't think we need to get emotional about South Africa. I don't think we need to be wedded solely to the South African economy. It's just that if you are looking for opportunities in an environment that you understand, an environment that you know, our history shows us that there are incredible opportunities to be taken advantage of. And of course, you want to diversify. Of course, you want to spread your wings. Of course, you want to go and look for other income streams around the world. South Africa is not a comfortable or easy place at the very best of times to do business. But for those who do crack it, the rewards are extraordinary.
So are you suggesting that building a business in South Africa can lend itself to opportunities in a future global market? Because if I listen to what you said earlier, Bruce, as you opened, you spoke extensively about COVID. The reality is that it's an 18-month forecast, and we have no certainty around what the environment will look like, nor will it ever return back to normal or not. We don't know. If we are used to dealing with problems, because we have extensive problems, if living and working in South Africa forces you into a place where you have to consider everything you do 5 times over, and through that garner and deepen your own self-knowledge, if you're armed with the ability to be resilient in the face of uncertainty, to be knowledgeable and authentic around who you are as a person, because you've had to listen to so many different arguments on so many different issues, so many different times, that it's required you to look at yourself. With those two opportunities that sit within us as South Africans, do you think that South Africa is a good place to build a business if you have intentions to build a global business too?
I mean, you just look at some of the many, many fintechs that have sprung up in recent years, lots of technology businesses, more, I think, in Cape Town than in Gauteng, but I stand to be corrected on that. There are a huge number of people using the relatively cheap labor, the geographical, the sort of longitude of South Africa to build businesses that are globally relevant. I mean, you look at a company like Aerobotics, you may or may not have heard about them, but these are guys using artificial intelligence, combining it with drone technology and using that to map agricultural fields. So, I mean, orchards in the Western Cape or vineyards in the Western Cape, and have taken that technology across to the United States, where the vast plains of Middle America are an impossibility for anybody who is a farmer to really cover with any degree of certainty, to check whether there is disease or whether there's dry patches or whatever the case might be, to check their yields from the air. And what these guys at Aerobotics are now doing is they're tying into insurance companies, so that insurance companies are getting data on their clients and are also then able to better price their insurance. And Aerobotics has built that business out of South Africa. There's a group of guys, and I forget their name right now, they just raised 50 million Rand in funding in January to take a management software program also into the United States. They use this management program for sales forces. Pardon?
Sam. The business is Sam. It's an outsourced sales services software. They used to be called Honeycomb, but they got bust on trademarks in the US. They had to change the names very quickly, based out of Cape Town.
But these guys, for example, are now going to be setting up an office in Atlanta because they've got this funding, because they have developed unique IP. That same company, by the way, the parent company, are a bunch of maths nerds who were at Stellenbosch in the 1990s and their plan was to go and join Arms Corps and develop weapons systems using electronical engineering and using their mathematical skills. And these guys were then gazumped by the fact that democracy came along, and then there was the merger of all of APLA and all of the defense forces of the ANC and the PAC and the South African Defense Force, of course, bringing all of these guys together with Umkhonto Wesizwe, and suddenly the army wasn't big enough for everybody, and these guys had to think differently. So they now do algorithms for, amongst others, the cell phone companies, but they've done work for NASA, they've done work for people around the world, and they are writing the software that makes the Meerkat Space Telescope at Sutherland inch for inch the most powerful space telescope in the world, and allows them to see so deep into the Milky Way it was deemed impossible 5 years ago. And these are a couple of Afrikaans guys from Stellenbosch University who had to make a plan because they weren't going to be able to go out and get the jobs they thought they'd get. And these are guys who are globally relevant. And there's so many other stories. I mean, the explosion of MTN into the African continent, the explosion of Nando's worldwide, Discovery taking vitality around the world, the SAB story of consolidating global beer markets. There are so many of these stories. Bidvest with what is now Bidcorp. And it's practically every corner of the world except the United States where they do food services. Remarkable entrepreneurial opportunism and activity.
So Bruce, I want to share a few questions from the audience that have come through. The first is from Herman Jonker, who says he really, I'm sorry, Bruce, likes the idea of setting 3 big goals at this point in time.
Okay.
And it very nicely into the question from Mike, who turns around and he says, is this not the perfect opportunity from the Flock team, that given the new normal will be online, that we can accelerate through government and big business the opportunity to provide data and internet infrastructure as almost a basic human right? Our president has been banging on about the 4th industrial revolution, and we now have a burning bridge that will take us there. Surely this is the time, along with dealing around the complexity of the COVID-19 virus, the time to actually mobilize the infrastructure needed. We've been waiting for how long now for the bandwidth spectrum to be released, Bruce?
Yeah. No, look, I mean, Pablo, I get the frustration. I really do. And I understand why you and so many people watching this are frustrated by my more political answer than a commercial answer. But the truth is that this is about politics. This is about power plays. This is about the sensitivities of power. And we run the risk of losing the plot over the fight against COVID-19 by trying to put government in a corner. You do not put people like Tito Mboweni and Gwede Mantashe and Cyril Ramaphosa in a corner, because when you do, the response you get is not necessarily going to be one that suits you. I urge, I mean, again, there is no excuse for government ineptitude. There is no excuse for a government failing to do its job. The Department of Mineral Resources is under considerably better management now than it was under Mosebenzi Zwane, but my 7-year-old could be running the Department of Mineral Resources better than Mosebenzi Zwane, with respect, ex-minister. Thank goodness, ex. You know, and there are huge egos at play here. We mustn't forget that. And first and foremost, we have to get as much control over the health crisis as we can. And by all means, the moment there is a level of certainty that maybe the curve is flattened and it can be contained, by all means, let's go hell for leather and utilize the goodwill and the experience of the time that we're in lockdown and the time of collaboration to get good economic outcomes. I mean, if there is one enormous upside to the down that we're all going through right now, and that is that President Cyril Ramaphosa has said to Tito Mboweni, this is your chance to implement structural reforms. This is your chance, because we have no money. We cannot be frittering away billions of rand every year in an economy that is contracting, in an economy that hasn't grown in 5 years, in an economy where expenditure has way outstripped any kind of fiscal performance. We cannot keep doing it that way. So come up with a plan to fix it. So there is a huge amount of stuff happening in the background. Have faith in that. Because I promise you, the last 2 people who want their name on a failed state are Cyril Ramaphosa and Tito Mboweni. These are 2 individuals who are deeply wedded to the idea that the ANC can make South Africa work. Whatever you think of their politics and whatever you think of them as individuals, that is entirely up to you. But ideologically, this is important to them. Ideologically, this is critical to somebody like Pravin Gordhan. So we've got to be mindful of the huge sensitivities that are at play. And sometimes discretion is the better part of valor in these things. Yes, it would be lovely to go and push through new agendas, but I think that it would actually do more harm than good, certainly in the short term.
Bruce, my last question to you is, there's lots of talk around an IFC funding stream that might come through and that might be required as a result, now motivated and ignited by COVID itself. What I do know is that in the earlier part of last year, for about the first 6 months of last year, there were lots of World Bank IFC types wandering around in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, through the political frameworks, through the big business environments. Do you think that we are going to go for a bailout? Do you think that if we do, it would set us off in a better direction or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, when you've got your back against the wall, anybody who's running their own business and watching this knows, and I'm sure everybody has been there. You've been there, Pavlo. You've been there where you've overpaid for an asset, and you've been very frank about it, and where you've got yourself into trouble. Now, sensibly managed, a loan is an asset. Badly managed, a loan is a massive liability. Nobody wants to go cap in hand to the lenders of last resort, but they're called lenders of last resort for a reason. It's because nobody else will lend you money. Our borrowing costs are going to spike up very sharply. Already in the February budget, we were spending 15 cents out of every rand collected just on interest payments, just on serving interest payments. We're not going to find it easy to raise money in the traditional way around the world anymore. We are sub-investment grade. The game has changed. Our biggest ambition now must be to get ourselves back into, well, first to survive the COVID-19 crisis with as little fallout as possible, then to ignite growth in this economy. And people are talking about, and I've got to be careful how I do this, but they're talking about V-shaped recoveries. We're not going to get that one. Talking about W-shaped recoveries where there's a bit of a sucker rally and then we decline again and then hopefully recover again, but that's maybe too ambitious too. They talk about the bathtub recovery, which is a deep down and then flatlining for a long period of time and then recovering and getting out of it. They talk about the L-shaped recovery, and I don't know why they call it a recovery, because L-shape is you collapse and then you just flatline anyway. But I liked Gulam Belem at Standard Bank. He's the group chief economist at Standard Bank the other day. He says he believes we're going to get the Nike swoosh recovery, and that is the sharp decline followed by a period of gradual growth. And possibly that's the best that we can hope for. But we've got to manage this thing differently. And that's why, as frustrating as the last 2 years have been from a political perspective, from the president sitting on the fence perspective, from the president so cognizant of the fact that I mean, if you think that COVID-19 is virulent and toxic, I don't think it's any more virulent and toxic than working within the upper echelons of the ANC. I see so many parallels there, where in order to keep his job and in order to give South Africa a chance, he's had to do small, regular, incremental gains. And I encourage you just to Google afterwards, if you haven't done so already, JP Landman and Nedbank. Those two words will take you to recent reports that he has done on the extraordinary volume of progress that has been done. Yes, it's frustrating that the bad guys aren't locked up in jail. Yes, it's frustrating that there are people like Marcus Jooste walking around without a care in the world. That Brian Molefe is able to hang out apparently at the bull run, flowing out of the couches on his cell phone, talking loudly, putting on a brave face about the troubles that he inevitably faces over his mismanagement of state-owned enterprises, most prominent of which will be Eskom. But we've got to go through long, boring, tedious processes to ensure that the rule of law is sacrosanct and holds up. Because if we start trying to be expedient and try to rush things, it could end badly. I'm afraid patience is a virtue. Can I just leave you with one last thought? If we are in fact stopping now, Pavlo, which I think it is time to do, so that those hardworking souls who have very kindly taken time out of their diaries today, and thank you for doing it. I'm really, really grateful that you have, and thank you for your interest in the book and Pavlo and my discussions today and what we do on the radio on a Thursday night as well. But take the Bidvest view. And if you go into any Bidvest facility in the world, there are signs up everywhere, and the signs read, Bidvest does not participate in any recession. And when you first look at that, you go, what kind of lunatics are these? What kind of fruitcakes are these? What kind of people are these that try to ignore, they put their heads in the sand? I mean, you can't ignore a recession. It's a real thing. And we're going into a deep recession. The Business Unity South Africa says even a depression. What you've got to be mindful of, and why mindset is important in this particular time in our history, is that Bidvest statement is one that says we need to stand out above our competitors. Everybody is in the same environment. We all have very similar fears about COVID-19. We all have very similar fears about a deep, dark recession and contraction in the economy. All of us are frightened. But those who are able to navigate what is coming, those who are able to think differently with a growth mindset about what is coming, are people who, when a recovery happens, and there will be a recovery. I'm just not going to put a time frame on it. And I also don't know how long and slow the Nike swoosh is going to be. But if you're taking the Bidvest approach that you don't ignore the fact that there is a recession, but you operate differently within that recessionary environment, you are going to be considerably better than your competitors who see that as a roadblock, who see that as an insurmountable obstacle. People who freeze up and panic in times of crisis go absolutely nowhere. And for opportunists and people with growth mindsets, frankly, this is the time to gird your loins and be those people.
And Bruce, I couldn't think of a better way to end your first digital book launch together. Thank you very much for the time.
I don't know if anybody has ever done a digital book launch in a lockdown with their books locked down as well. Pavlo, you're a superstar. Thank you very much to you, and thanks to everybody for coming to watch and to listen. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The book is available on Kindle, so it's digitally available. We've all got time. It's a good time to read it. I certainly found it inspiring. I certainly got a couple of ideas out of it. And during the periods where I look at carrying a substantial overhead in my own business, and I'm feeling the pressure of it, I have turned to the book to find some relief, some inspiration, knowing that I'm not alone. I'm not the first to ever been there, and nor will I ever be the first to be there. So I urge you to go and get it. I urge you to read it. I urge you to enjoy it and consume it. And Bruce, once again, thank you very much. And to everyone who attended, it was fantastic having you. Thank you so much. We'll make the recording available and we'll push it out to everyone who was present. Thank you all. Have a good day further. Bye-bye.